Sorry about that, you guys.
Okay, good afternoon, and I'd like to call to order the March 1st, 2021 Planning and Building Committee meeting. And I'd like to start off with a roll call and just answer here when I call your name. And first of all, let's see, Carl DeSimas, you're
Here.
Yeah, Paul Rice.
Here.
Bob Larson.
Here.
Councilmember Franich.
Here.
Katrina Knudsen.
Here.
Michelle Thomas.
Here.
Mayor Kuhn.
Here.
And Councilmember Markley.
Here.
And our guest today, Jessica Gwilt, I think is the way you pronounce it, I hope.
Yes.
Okay. With that, I'd like to have an approval for the February 1st, 2021 Planning and Building Committee meeting minutes. Do I have a motion?
Move to approve the minutes.
Second.
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
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 Approved. Okay, agenda items. We've got Jessica Gwilt here with us this afternoon, and she's going to give us a overview on the buildable lands. So I'm going to hand it over to her. And we've come to an agreement that we're going to go page by page in terms of questions, because I know there's going to be a lot of questions. And rather than wait to the end and run out of time or forget what we had asked or what we had thought before, we'll just go page by page. So we'll see how that works. So Jessica, with that, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen really fast to do the PowerPoint. All right, can everyone see and hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. All right, so thank you, committee members, for having me here today. Jessica Gwilt, I'm a senior planner with Pierce County Planning and Public Works. I am the program coordinator for the Buildable Lands program out of Pierce County, and here to give you an overview of what we're doing with that program and the mandated report today. So I'll go through kind of building step by step what we're required to do, how we interpret that, and how other jurisdictions have a role in it as well. I'll mention another project that I believe is also on your agenda later today that's related to it, and then let you know what to expect in the next couple months before the report is due of materials that will be coming out for review. So first I want to talk about the purpose of the Buildable Lands program and the Growth Management Act requirements. The program itself it's like an ongoing program where we collect data and monitor development within the county. The county, Pierce County government is the mandated jurisdiction agency that oversees this program. So we're required, Pierce County, and there's 7 total buildable lands counties per GMA that are required to be kind of the administrator of this program. And then we are required through our countywide planning policies to coordinate with the cities and towns to collect data and develop the report. So part of it is monitoring. So we try to collect data annually. We're gonna, I think, start doing that a little more actively and interpret that data and show development trends over the course of a number of years. And we have data now back to, I believe it's 1995 is when we started collecting it. So one of the things that I'm actually working on right now is putting all of that information into one data set and spreadsheet for jurisdictions to be able to access and use. So that's part of something that we do as part of the program. We also look at all of the comprehensive plans for all the jurisdictions and collect information on how zones are administered. And then you kind of compare the permit data to the zoning and say, you know, is it developing at the densities or the rates or with the types of uses that were intended per the plans. So that's just a monitoring thing that we do and are mandated to through the Growth Management Act. The Buildable Lands report originally It was meant to be a 5-year check-in, so we didn't do it within the GMA periodic cycle in the very beginning. It was every 5 years you report on what happened in those 5 years prior, and then you keep building on that. And I want to say after the second report, which was, I think it was 2007 is when there was the last one that was a 5-year program. They switched it to be 1 year or 2 years before the periodic update for the Growth Management Act. And the purpose of that was it switched from being a check-in to a baseline for the comprehensive plan updates for GMA. And that shift, I believe, was made because of it used to be fully funded. And then there was a point where we had unfunded mandates. And so it went with the GMA instead of, or the periodic update instead of being a check-in. There were also some updates to the Buildable Lands legislation in 2017, 2018. And so throughout this presentation, I'll also highlight things that have changed because of that new legislation. And that was the first significant legislative change since the inception of the Buildable Lands program. So we were doing it a certain way for a while, and then there were some additional requirements. I'll point out what they were. For the most part, we already accounted for a lot of them, so there weren't significant changes to our particular program. So the report is, so we monitor development data and trends throughout the program. And then the report as the check-in and now, baseline for your capacity on your comprehensive planning. The report really looks at each jurisdiction and countywide, the amount of land that is available and suitable for potential development. It's not parcel specific in a way. Yeah, we do an inventory that categorizes parcels, but it's really your jurisdiction as a whole. Can it accommodate housing and employment needs over the 20-year planning period? It's a very high level analysis with high level answers. And so the way that we do that is to develop assumptions based on that data that we collected and think, these certain zones are developing at these densities or uses. And then we use that information to project out how much potential capacity there is in that 20-year period. And then once you have the information about that capacity, you compare that to your growth targets, which we'll talk about in a little bit of detail. So there is a connection between the growth targets and the capacity, and it's really making sure that you have the room in your urban growth area to accommodate that target. So I'm going to go into detail on each one of these, but if you kind of have any questions about the overall purpose and requirements, go ahead and ask now.
I should have asked earlier on the UGA, that is considered to go with the urban entity that goes with that UGA, I assume?
Yes. Yeah. So the urban growth area, we basically take each jurisdiction, and then we have the potential annexation areas that are associated with each jurisdiction. Those are just kind of lumped into the unincorporated urban section. But we are able, so when we do the capacity, we're not doing the capacity necessarily for each potential annexation area, but we'll show in the inventory, you'll be able to visually see how much land is being categorized a certain way.
Okay. The second question on the available land, that which is basically undeveloped but is zoned, what kind of assumption do you make in terms of, particularly if it's zoned residential, what assumptions do you make within that zoning designation as far as density? Do you go to minimum density, maximum density, mean density?
The density is based on the permit data that we collect. So we look at each zone and say, okay, there's a range. Typically there's a range. You have a minimum and maximum, and sometimes a base density. So we collect permit data for all those zones. When it comes to residential plats are really telling, because that's when you're determining the density of at least single family. We collect multifamily permits separately and look at them a little differently, but we summarize all of this information by each zone and are able to see yearly the ebbs and flows of how many lots are being created or how many housing units are being created and what densities they're building out at. And then you can look at the constraints like different critical areas or roads and all of the things that you net out for density. And we collect all of that information and kind of average it and look at it yearly as well to see what it's actually building out at. And then you use that information to set the assumption, because it's the most realistic number, because it is what they're building out at. If we don't have that permit information, because say, the recession, there was a lot of kind of blank spaces in our last report, or just because of maybe a zone isn't seeing as much development because it's been building out and doesn't have as much available land in it. Then we would look at the development regulations and the minimum and maximum zones, densities, and work with the jurisdictions to kind of find a number within that range that makes sense.
Okay. Thank you.
Anything else? Move on.
Yeah. Do you take into account, I know you wouldn't know this, but do you take into account possible land that might be future in our UGA? For instance, the airport, the Tacoma Narrows Airport is not in our UGA, but it's an area that once we need to expand our UGA might be. So do you look at future possible annexation of UGA land and what that, to take into account that?
If it's rural today, we wouldn't, because we don't do the capacity analysis for rural land. If it is urban, but not necessarily in your associated urban growth area, we would have that information and could provide it. It's not something we would have in the report, but we would have done the capacity analysis for that area to be able to kind of tease that out of the bigger number. But for if it's rural land, it's not something that we do.
Okay, as we walk through this, if there are any of those parts, please let us know about that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're ready to move on.
Okay. All right, so now we're just gonna keep getting in a little more detail each time. And so I developed this slide to talk about, what I have to do as the county administrator of this program, and then what we try to coordinate with for cities and towns. And typically this starts at the staff level, and then we encourage staff to, brief everything up to council members and management as well to be able to provide information. A lot of the coordination, we rely on cities and towns to review the results of the, each little step that we take in this program or the report process, because I personally look at a lot of land all the time, but you guys know the ins and outs of your communities and the specifics of what's happening and, the likelihood of development and that sort of a thing in your own jurisdictions. And so that's always really, really helpful to us to be the most accurate in reporting. So the first thing that we do is, establish the procedures and set the methodologies. And we've done this. We started in, it was mid 2018. I think we started talking about the procedures and the methodology in light of the new legislation and how that would affect us, and just make sure that we have the best available information, data. That we use now a GIS model to be able to do the inventory. So we try to improve each time that we do the report. Next, we would be collecting, and this is something that we're trying to do yearly so that we can get ahead of the curve. But everyone's super busy, and so it's never quite worked out that way, but I'm hoping to move forward by collecting it yearly. But eventually we just ask for all of your permit data since the last report, start to analyze it, and like I said, summarize them by zone so that you understand how your zones are developing. So then you'd submit that to us. We'd do that summarization process and then send it back to confirm and use that to update your assumptions if desired. And then using those assumptions and that information, we would do the buildable lands inventory. Like I said, we run a GIS model that takes those assumptions and does kind of a cause and effect categorization. So there's a couple categories I'll get into on the next slide. And each one of them has different assumptions to it and that sort of a thing. So there's a lot of things going on with the inventory, and it spits out like a shapefile layer that has those categories in it. And then we would send that to the cities and towns to look at in a closer, parcel specific level and give us feedback on how they're categorized. And then we would update the inventory based on that information. Once we have that inventory, we move to the capacity part. I want to mention the inventory, we don't do parcel specific capacity. The capacity is all done at a zone level. And the purpose of that is to avoid speculation of how a property is going to be developed. We can't say, there's just no way to determine, if in a mixed use zone, this one's going to be residential and that one's going to be commercial, or this one's going to develop at this density and that one's this. So we try to aggregate everything and use averages and assumptions to put out the most reasonably likely capacity that is possible. And again, not to get capacity confused with what it would actually build out as. Capacity is really how much is available and reasonable to be available for development. It's not the number that says how much development is going to occur. It's just a checkpoint to make sure that you have enough land zoned appropriately to accommodate the amount of population and employment increases that we're expecting over our 20-year planning period. So with that capacity, once you understand how much land is available and what, if you multiply that available land by the assumed densities, whether it's employment density or housing density, the result of that, you would start comparing to things like your targets and your plans, and then determine if they're all consistent with each other. And so that's what we publish in the Buildable Lands Report, and that's the requirement of the county. We send it to Commerce. The cities and towns we rely on to check it before we do submit it and provide any comments at that point if there needs to be edits. The kind of final step is looking at, we go back to that, the consistency between the capacity, how much land you have available within your urban growth areas versus how much population and employment you're expecting. If those numbers are significantly different, we would want to highlight those in a consistency analysis. And then we kind of work with and leave it up to the jurisdiction to determine if there's any measures that need to be taken to correct those inconsistencies. And I'll get into detail about each one of these steps in the next couple of slides too. This is just a real overall process. So let me know if you have any questions about the process at this point. I'll get into more detail about the inventory, the capacity, and the consistency analysis reasonable measures in the next couple slides.
Okay, Councilmember Savage. Jim.
Yeah, so, thank you, Councilmember Himes. So these don't become a moving target. I mean, we set we go through the buildable lands inventory and we calculate the capacity, and that's the foundation, right?
Yes. Yeah, so that's kind of your static baseline to determine how and if you want to adjust any of your future planning. So it informs what is available currently to be built as, and then from there you would determine, are we meeting our target with that amount of land? Do we need to adjust in any way? And you can use that information to make policy decisions in your comprehensive plans.
So it's not, and I'll be curious when you start describing what the new legislation was, because I'm concerned that, we're setting these ground rules, so to speak, and, we're supposed to be on a 20-year or actually 24-year plan here now. that they're not going to, somewhere 15 years from now, they're going to change the ground rules.
Yeah, and it would take, again, a legislative change. The first one that we've had happened, I think 20 something years after. And so I'm hoping that we don't have to shift again. And the big changes that we saw with the new legislation really had to do with refining the assumptions. So because of new technology and zoning changes, having more, I guess, there's more regulations today than there were that existed when the Buildable Lands program was created. And so a lot of the changes were intended to track that and reflect it in the capacity. So yeah, I don't foresee a lot of changes occurring in the future. We tend to think, it's a pretty straightforward process. We already have a lot of good methodologies in place, and have actually lobbied to not really add any more requirements to this, because it starts turning into like a market study, which is not the intent of the Buildable Lands program as well. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. Mayor Q.
Yes. How do you determine how dense a parcel can be if they possibly could tie into our sewer? For instance, there's a piece of property that was in our UGA, and they paid extra money to tie into the sewer, and so they were able to build twice the density. So now some parcels that's going to be fairly easy to do in our UGA, and some parcels that's going to be impossible or difficult. So how are you going to know to calculate that as, okay, it's twice the density than is currently allowed because they'll tie into the sewer, or we don't know that, so we don't do that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And that actually ties into one of the new requirements is identifying infrastructure gaps. So one of the way that we are going to address that is, well, ingrained in the density assumption is the fact that some are sewered and some are not. So it does allow an average of that range. And Pierce County, our jurisdiction sees that a lot in our short platting. So like short plats, a lot of the time are not sewered. And so you can kind of assume what a certain density is on that side. And then, your formal plats tend to be a little more sewered, but you can look into the permit data to understand the difference between them and then make assumptions based on that. The way that we're approaching it is land that is a certain distance from sewer would be assumed that they're using that regular, sewered density. And then the other ones, either you're assuming less of the land is being developed, or you're going to apply a lower density to it. The way that we've kind of decided is to just reduce the amount of land that is available, because that automatically reduces the number of units that would be, instead of having two density assumptions, you would just further reduce the land that is not available to be sewered. And I think we're looking at between something that's about 300 feet from sewer is more likely. If you're getting more than like 600 feet from sewer, it starts to be cost prohibitive to tie into it. And so those are the standards that we've been looking at, and we'll see what the result of it is and the difference between them when we get to the capacity part and are able to dig into the inventory and look at where there are infrastructure gaps versus what ones would be sewered.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Without getting down to the specific parcels of land, how do you account for what I would call truly non-buildable land? Wetlands, streams, bluffs. I can go down the list.
Absolutely.
Places where you can't build that would subtract from the usable land.
So that's a really great question. We do two things. One is in our assessor, because we use the assessor treasurer's parcel database, right? Within that, there are land use descriptions and what are they called? They're basically tell you what the property is taxed as or used for. And that's like the first cut that we use. So there's ones that'll say like well sites or utilities or, water. You can't build on water. I mean, I guess you could, but we're not doing that. So that's the first cut, is we just look at the land use description and completely remove them, like cemeteries or landfills, things like that. We just outright take them out of the equation and call them unbuildable. And then there's a second layer for especially jurisdictions that do a net density, as Gook Harbor does, where there's, critical areas are just completely removed from the density calculation when you're going in for a plat, right? So we use the layers that you would net out in our GIS. So like we have wetlands and some steep slopes and things like that. And we take the actual physical land and we take that acreage out of the equation altogether.
Good. Okay. Okay, we're ready to move on to the next slide, I think.
Right, so now we're going to get into a little more detail about what that inventory and capacity analysis do. So I think that was a really great lead in. So we have a couple categories. Vacant subdividable is land that is large enough, to be multiple units, especially when you're talking about this. This one is more single family zone, so subdividable versus single unit. If it's a certain size, we're just assuming one unit is going to be associated with that. If it's not going to, if the size of the land and the amount of units that are possible, are not going to, you're not going to be able to get much more than one. We just automatically call that a one. The ones that are subdividable are put into kind of a larger pot by zone and applied some deductions that I'll explain next, and then the densities. So they're kind of more up for calculation at that point. And then we have underutilized land, which means there is an associated use. Whether there's a building or not, it depends what it's being used for. So it could be something like, parking, or like a current use property. I don't know if our tax program might be a vacant property, but it's in a tax program. So there is a disincentive to develop it because you have to take it out of that program and you have to pay back taxes. So we include that in underutilized. And then your regular stuff, like any kind of commercial or industrial development, or a house on a certain amount of acres. And so underutilized means that there's either a use or an existing unit or some amount of use, so something on that property. And the density or whatever it's being used as today is much less than its potential. So we do a calculation on that property that says, say there's one house on 5 acres, and you do the calculation, you really, you can allow 6 units per acre. You're hitting a certain threshold of saying, there's enough units that you could get out of that property that it would make it incentivized to build on. And so it gets kicked into this underutilized, where you could use the land for more than what it's being used for today, and that would be marketable to do that. And our thresholds for, I think, residential is if you can get at least 2.5 times more whatever is on there, then it would get kicked in. And then I think commercial is a little heavier. It's like 5 times. So we do like a 1-to-5 ratio. So say there's only one job on that property, but you could get 5 out of it, or multiply that by whatever it is. That's how it would get kicked in. So it depends on what the use is on the ground and the comparison to what it could be potentially. And then the undevelopable, I just explained, is all the different categories that just aren't available to be developed anymore. And then built out is the ones that we put through the underutilized, but they didn't make it. They just couldn't make any more. It wasn't, whatever, marketable enough to add any more units or jobs to that property. So,
Councilmember Frank, a question.
Yeah, I think that would be a good spot to answer.
Yeah. Is there a map of underutilized parcels?
Yes, so the last version that we have is the 2010 base layer. So it's going to look a lot different. I mean, it's been 10 years, so it'll look a lot different this time around. We don't have them available yet. We're working on it with our transportation planning. They're running the model right now and working out a few kinks. So I'm hoping by the end of the month, we should have that for review.
Okay, and that's available on a website somewhere?
Yeah, so the 2010 layer is, if you go on our Buildable Lands website and look at the 2014 report, it's in the appendices, all the maps are. And then for the 2020 version that we're going to have available, we'll put a link to an online GIS map. So you can actually, it'll be like Google Maps. You can go around and click on things and see why it got categorized that way.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other hands other than mine here? Yeah, I had two questions. One, what do you do with the rising popularity of accessory dwelling units? What's the assumption there?
So accessory dwelling units are, well, we recognize that they are allowed and they serve as housing. They aren't a part of buildable lands or the target process because they're not tied into the density. So I think it's a conversation we're going to have, and it's certainly something that if a jurisdiction isn't showing they have enough land available for their target, we're going to have to talk about, but if they allow accessory dwelling units, there is an assumption that there would be additional capacity associated with those. So we'll recognize it if it needs to be recognized, but it's not something we track yet because it's not a requirement of the Buildable Lands program per GMA. And but it is this thing that we acknowledge as part of the greater housing availability, but it's not tied to the densities, so we don't use it as an assumption in the report. It tends to be tied to the conversion between persons per household and housing units, in a sense, because we don't count them toward the total housing unit inventory.
Okay, I guess a follow-on question to that is you mentioned the underutilized land on, let's say, a given parcel of land, a huge amount of land, single family residence, for example, and going with what that land could have built on it versus what it's got on it, okay? Which obviously gets into a zoning discussion, I think, called, does that happen very often? And how do you resolve that little problem? I could see us basically rezoning a whole bunch of stuff, literally lot by lot. if it could get to that extreme, okay? And maybe you can enlighten us a little bit on that.
And that's why we don't do the parcel specific capacity analysis. It's a very good example. And that is why, we look at it as a greater zoning and assume, and it could be even, you're looking at that property and we're calling it underutilized in the inventory, but really the property next to it is the one that's underutilized, but it didn't meet the category. And so that's kind of where we have this flexibility with it within the assumptions. Is it's a theoretical just indicator of potential. It's not the end all. This one's going to redevelop because it's in this zone and the assumptions say that it would. You know what I mean? So okay. Hopefully that's a helpful answer. It's one of those. That's why we lump everything together, so you don't start looking at the parcels themselves and saying, "Oh, this one I'm going to do this way," because it's going to. We want it to develop a certain way. You really want to look at your overall zoning as a kind of visioning, policy-driven set for your communities and how you want them to grow. Okay. So we try to separate those.
Okay, that one I'm gonna have to think about some more. I'm not sure. I got a headache thinking about it. But okay. Any other questions? Okay, why don't we move on then?
All right, and so we take that inventory again, like I said, and aggregate them by zone and category. So for each zone, you're going to have vacant, subdividable, and underutilized that are going to get some further analysis. The vacant single units are just going to be put in a bucket for add in at the end, and then the undevelopable and built out are taken out of the equation. The second step is now this is one of the new steps. We're accounting for infrastructure gaps. And the way that we're doing that is in that summarizing the land by zone and category, we're going to identify how much of that acreage is land that has an infrastructure gap, mainly being sewer, because that is what directly affects the density, or just number of units or how much of a parcel is used. From there, we take those acreages that are there, left over, and we split them by what type of use we're assuming is going to be there. So certain zones allow for both housing and commercial development, and we look at the overall build out of that zone with our permit data and see how much of it is being used for different types of things, and use that to inform our assumption of how much acreage is going for each category. So it could be a 50-50 split, it could be 90-10. It really depends on the zone. From there, they get separated into basically two tables where we do extra calculations. So we have a housing table and an employment table. The housing table has a lot more deductions to it because there's things like the critical areas and roads when it comes to plats for single family zones. There's things like, especially single family zones that allow for civic uses. So uses that are not going to result in housing, we take we look at the permit data and take a percentage out of that and add it into our employment categories. And then there is an assumption for the market factor. So we usually call this the land that is unavailable for development, based on things like, has it been in somebody's family for a really long time and they plan on holding on to it, even though it could be developable. So yeah, things like the market fluctuations, owner intent, the things that you can't necessarily see if you looked on GIS, but are ingrained into that property. For some of those, we do, like I said, rely on the jurisdictions to be able to flag certain properties that may or may not be more or less lucrative for development based on your knowledge of them. If there's a property with a lot of issues that it's not super clear when it comes to the GIS data, we want to know that so that we can flag it and take it out. And again, things that look like they might not be developable, but somebody has talks right now about developing them. We try to capture those as pipeline projects. So I'll talk about that at the end. So we do all these deductions and then we end up with an acreage at the end that is that acreage of land that is available technically within that 20-year time frame. And then you multiply that by your density assumption. So it's either housing units per acre or employees per acre, depending on what table you're in. So you have a total number based on that acreage when it came to the vacant subdividable and the underutilized lands. Then we add in the vacant single units and pipeline. Pipeline, again, is projects that are active right now but have not been finalized. So we try to take those into account to get a more accurate sense of the developability of that property, because it already is developing. So if you know how much capacity is on that property already, we want to count that toward whatever it would be building out at. So we do collect that and assign them and add them into the capacity as well, in lieu of doing the calculation that I just described. And then at the very end, with the underutilized properties, typically there is some sort of use. So there's either a housing unit or an assumption of how many employees are working on that property. We take that out of the equation at the end because we're assuming, we're assuming full redevelopment of that property. And then we factor out that which was displaced if you did fully redevelop of it.
Okay. Councilwoman Green.
That often does not happen. A lot of the times they're kept, but it does take that one, you would be able to create one unit, but that unit's already there. So we're just taking it out. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, there's a lot of there seems like there's a lot of assumptions that can have some definite, you make an assumption over here and it makes a big difference over here. So, that's a little troubling. And maybe that's why a few slides back when you review this on a more periodic basis, you can kind of flesh some of those assumptions out. My main question is, what do you classify as an infrastructure gap?
The infrastructure gap would, and the only one that we're focusing on, so this was a new requirement, we had to create a way to address it based on the new legislation. And they really left it up to the jurisdictions on how to interpret that. And ours is sewer is the easiest to determine whether a property is going to develop at a certain rate or not. And we're avoiding saying, you know, they're not going to develop at all, or there's not a, I guess it's not, you're still not predicting if it's going to develop, it's just, does it have capacity to? And so the way that we addressed that is distance from sewer. If it's a reasonable distance from sewer to be able to get it, you know, hook up into it, it would just be treated normal. But if it's so far of a distance from the sewer, you're just going to assume that you're getting less units there. And the way that we're doing that is by just reducing the amount of land that's being multiplied by the density. We're just reducing it by a little bit to account for that reduction in units that you can only get so many if you're on septic.
So, but that would mean that as this so-called gap gets filled in, then the next parcels down the line, all of a sudden, they are closer to the sewer than they were before that the first so-called gap got filled in.
Yeah, and then so the next time we run it, that would show. Whereas you're trickling closer and closer until you're increasing the capacity by doing that.
Okay. Thank you.
And I do want to mention that the assumptions, the jurisdiction really decides what the assumptions are. We have to list them out of all the ones that are available to use. And then based on how you regulate is going to dictate what assumptions you actually use and what the deductions really are. How much of a percent down you're reducing the amount of acreage you're saying is available for capacity. So it's for some, it could be very little, even though we're saying we have all these deductions. And some it could be a lot because there are so many restrictions or critical areas or something like that. It really just depends.
So do you mean the individual jurisdictions or the jurisdictions of Pierce County?
Each jurisdiction, so like Gig Harbor has their own assumptions that are based on how you develop, how you regulate land. We try to mimic the regulations.
Okay, thank you.
I think you had a question.
So yeah, so it's tricky because so short plats, we used to have a rule where short plats could basically clear cut, and what they would do is they would keep piggybacking. So they just take 3 parcels, they'd short plat every single one, and they clear cut the whole. Now you have 12 homes, they're completely clear. So if we accept some UGA land down the road, and now it's not to the standards that we basically wanted, you probably don't have the same rules that we do, and so now you let people keep short platting, and then we annex that land, and now it's really not in the liking of what we wanted for the character. I guess that's why we kind of get kind of concerned. Is you have to look. I don't think you look at our rules to determine when someone wants to short plat what is going to be desirable to our city down the road when we annex in. So I guess we're just left with how it is we try to make it so our utility hookups are similar when we annex in, and we got caught with that some, but is that just the way it is? So if yeah,
it would. I mean, this process doesn't determine how that's done. This is just recreating what is allowed today. And so, so for within unincorporated, we would be using those rules. And then within the city, when it comes to the capacity analysis, certainly I think when it comes to the zoning regulations themselves, that's another conversation that we could have separately about how we approach that. I know
Right.
at least the zoning, we try, you guys have the future land use identified in your comprehensive plans for your potential annexation areas. So that's at least helpful when it comes to land use. But yeah, the other part of it, the regulation side, would be separate from this process,
Right.
but does inform it for sure.
Katrina, do you know, we probably can't, but if, let's say someone wants to tie into our sewer, but they want to do codes that are not what we allow, can we deny them to tie into sewer if they start doing things that are not what we allow in our city, so that down the road they conform?
The city does have policies that, if followed, we can not allow a development within the UGA to hook up to our sewer. What I would say to the issue that you're bringing up, however, Mayor, is we're working on our urban growth area analysis this year and hoping to work with Pierce County on a potential urban growth area management agreement. And through that, UGAMA is where we would hope to have both of the jurisdictions understand and work toward a shared vision of the UGA, and the outcome of that could be an update to capacity analysis for the next buildable lands report. It would not be done in time for this one, but it is something that in the future could be beneficial to this process.
Great. Yeah, we all look very much looking forward to that. Thank you.
Okay.
I'll mention too in our the update to the Gig Harbor Community Plan. I had talked to the planner before this meeting about that the annexation study. There is an implementation action in our community plan that says to coordinate and review the results of the work that you're doing as well. So they are kind of tied to each other policy-wise.
Thank you, Jessica.
All right, any other questions about the capacity analysis and assumptions?
Okay.
All right. So at the end of the capacity analysis, we end up with a number on each side, housing units and employees, when it comes to the capacity of that land that is available and suitable for potential development. Capacity, again, meaning what's available, not necessarily what's going to be developed. And we use that number a couple of different ways to determine consistency in a couple areas. The first one that's a little more straightforward is we look at those permit data trends and what's allowed in your comprehensive plan and the assumed densities that we're using. And we determine if we're building at that range. So it's just a check that your regulations and your zoning code says you're allowed to do certain things. Is what being built reflecting that? And typically the answer is yes. And so that's one of the questions that we answer in that consistency analysis. The second one is the capacity versus the targets. We have a year to complete this after the report is complete. Our target, which I think it's in the next slide, I'll touch on it and then you'll talk about it later in your meeting. The targets are taking, they're on a different track than buildable land, so they won't be complete by the time the report is complete. So we'll have the capacity number to be able to compare to the targets, but that comparison won't be done until the targets are done. And we do have a year to be able to do that. So this is that, do we have suitable land to accommodate growth within the UGA? And the big ticket item when it comes to the capacity versus the targets is the county-wide number. It's not, while we do analyze the consistency between each jurisdiction and their capacity versus their targets and talk about reasonable measures on a smaller scale, the UGA cannot be increased if there is a significant excess of capacity and compared to our county-wide target, which is pretty typical with Pierce County because we do have a large urban growth area. So when it comes to meeting countywide planning policies related to sizing the UGA, that's the county-wide number that we focus on, not the individual number. But the individual jurisdiction numbers are looked at with our consistency analysis just to make sure that you have enough land available and zoned appropriately to accommodate that growth. The next one is new. So this is something that was added with the updates to the legislation in 2017, 2018. And it has to do with housing production and the targets. So we're comparing the housing production rates. I think the data that we're going to end up using is per OFM, the housing unit counts that each jurisdiction sends OFM each year. We'll track those and look at the production rate of how many housing units are coming in and compare them to see, essentially you take that trend line and you project it out to the 20-year planning period and see if you continued at that rate, would you achieve your target? So it's just saying, are you building enough to meet the target, or have enough housing to accommodate those targets? So when you find, excuse me, sorry, I have a really sore throat, and so talking has been more difficult. But if you find an inconsistency between these two, the answers, no to one of these questions, or all of them, or some range of them, you would consider what we call reasonable measures. And we've never outwardly said, these jurisdictions have to do reasonable measures because this, and this. Our consistency analysis tends to be just a look at indicators. And so we'll say, how far within the range are you? Are you getting really close? Is it a significant number of units that you're missing, or is it just a high percent? Or so we do a couple different qualitative kind of approaches in the analysis, and then we leave it up to the jurisdictions to take that and determine what they want to do about it in their comprehensive plans. So this part is really to inform your periodic update. And if you're inconsistent to a certain degree, you want to consider reasonable measures to correct those inconsistencies. I just listed here some of the typical ones. Rezoning is a big one. You can keep your zoning, but maybe change the regulations or the densities in that height. Parking has a huge impact on how many units are able to be developed. And sometimes density calculation actually can result in higher number of units available, or you could adopt incentives. And this is all saying you don't necessarily have to do this unless there is an indicator that you're not meeting or you're inconsistent with one of the three things that I have listed here. So any questions about consistency and reasonable measures?
Yeah.
Is that me or you, Bob?
You.
Okay, so what is the time frame that you are going to be reviewing these for inconsistencies and giving jurisdictions ultimatums?
We haven't, I don't know that we have ever given anyone an ultimatum. We put the information out there, and then it comes down to, I think it's more about your certification and how you determine what you're going to approach to say that you're meeting something or another. But the county doesn't say, these jurisdictions need to adopt reasonable measures and they should consider these. We just do a high level analysis, and then you use that information for your comprehensive plans and their updates. So the report is due June 30th of this year. And then we have a year to provide this information to you before we start getting into so that would be June 30th, 2022. And then assuming we're going to start talking about our periodic updates at that point. And then we would just collect information on the things that you've adopted if it was indicated that you might need to consider reasonable measures, and we're available to work through them. But we haven't ever been in the business of requiring you to do anything necessarily.
But is there any language in this new legislation that is going to say that, we're supposedly planning on a 20 or 30 year horizon, and if things are slow the first 5 years, is there a mechanism that's going to happen? They're going to say, hey, you guys aren't living up to your plan, and you need to start doing some of these things you have listed on the right.
See, and that's what it depends. It's if you can provide justification on, this is a temporary thing and we're only growing so much at this point, but it's, we could backlog some of that growth or whatever. I know jurisdictions have done that before too. They're saying, we're growing a lot right now, but we expect that to taper off if that's something that's like, you're too far beyond I know that they did that before, but it really is, it's more about the certification, and we leave that up to PSRC and Commerce to certify plans. And so it's one of those things where you have to determine if you're going to address and how you're going to address it, or you do make justifications to say why you're an anomaly or why it's different and there's not as necessarily as large of the need as it seems to.
So
lessen that inconsistency. It just depends on the situation.
Is there that much latitude? And I didn't know that there was any legislation in 2017-18 that was, adding these bottom two parts in, but I'm always very skeptical when things get into the OFM's hands. They have a certain way of looking at things, and a local jurisdiction may have a different way of looking at things, and they're the ones with the big hammer.
Yeah, it's
Jessica, if I may, under the review and evaluation program, Councilmember Cranich, and I can send you this update that was effective January 1st. Typically, what we've seen is reasonable measures that have needed to be taken place in a jurisdiction that's not growing, or is not seeing the housing growth that is projected. And so some of the major areas like Bremerton and Tacoma that have these large targets and are not having the housing generation rates that were foreseen may need to take into consideration these reasonable measures that Jessica's talking about, such as, an increase of density or increase in height or some parking factors in order to get development to spur. But notwithstanding, obviously, the results of Pierce County and our report, we know for a fact that City of Gig Harbor, we overachieved in terms of what the target was and what has been constructed during this last evaluation period. And so, notwithstanding, again, the report, I wouldn't see us that we're going to have to increase density or increase height or anything like that. It'll be potentially something we'll have to write a justification of why we grew so fast with, and we know it's based on development agreements and things like that. But as far as these reasonable measures affecting the City of Gig Harbor, my professional recommendation is that likely we won't need to worry about this to this extent that other cities will.
Okay.
Any other questions? I guess along that same line, and in fact, it just dawned on me, it should have dawned on me earlier. If you're working on actual permit data on trends, that doesn't necessarily line up with the way the code is currently written in Gig Harbor. We went through what I would call the Wild West phase, where we built all over the place and fairly high densities in some areas, mainly because of PRDs and all kinds of acronyms of overlays you could do and tricks you could play. And I'm sure, at least off the top of my head, I'm reasonably confident that the permit data would show a much higher density. And by the way, that's the other question is how far does this permit trend go back and what does it include? Okay. But I suspect over the last probably 5 years, we are fairly dense in terms of reality. And that reality was challenged back 4 years ago in an election. The residents were kind of upset about it. And we have since backed off on some of our zoning requirements, particularly as it relates to density, particularly the tricks you could do on various planned communities, that kind of thing. where you could basically defeat the basic zoning requirements dealing with density. So it kind of begs the question: is zoning a reasonable basis to say that, hey, if with the you've got, if that trend were to continue, and it's not continuing right now, and it probably won't, that the zoning requirements become more of a control versus the permit data of the last, say, 5 years. So that's a question. I guess that's a question and a statement. But if you could explain a little bit, Carl, how far does that trend go back? Okay, and is the zoning a reasonable argument if the permit data says, well, you should be extremely dense versus what the zoning data would currently suggest?
Yes, so one of the things that we do is we track changes in the zoning as well to compare them to what it was building out at. So for changes that happen since the permits, we're able to account for those when we look at the zoning, the regulation summaries of what the actual density allowed today is when we're starting to do the report. And so then you take the permit data with a grain of salt at that point. And I've been going through Gig Harbor's permit data as well and noticed the abundance of planned development that was permitted. And so one of the things that I do is planned developments are treated differently. They're treated more like pipeline. So if it is zoned for something that has a specific development agreement and build out, it in itself, those properties would be treated differently than the ones that are just zoned for, this density by this density. So when it comes to those planned developments, they will not be impacting the other zoning, the assumed density on any other properties aside from those ones that particularly built out, and whatever is left over in their development agreements would be reflected in the capacity. We do have data dating back to, like I said, 1995. So if there's certain zones that are similar and allow the same types of zoning, we could use that information. Or if we don't have enough permit data to reflect what the regulations allow, we look at kind of a range, and we try to be conservative, actually, instead of saying, they're going to build out at max density every time. We really do kind of the lower end, not necessarily minimum density, but maybe an average of the two to be able to come up with a reasonable density assumption moving forward.
Okay. Yeah, we're going to have to, I think, watch very closely because I'm sure your data will show a significant trend in density from 1995 to what's been happening in the last probably 5 years in terms of density. Okay, thank you. All right. And you're down to your next to last slide.
Yeah, and so this is just because I've been referencing the targets, did want to note that we are going through that process to allocate those targets. Vision gives us Vision 2050 gives us kind of a baseline to work with in these groups, and then they're further allocated. So there's something like 5,000 persons. We're still working on the employment as well. That'll be allocated between multiple cities and towns within the category that Gig Harbors in. So it's just another thing to be aware of. And I know that it is on your guys' radar. So this does tie into the reasonable measures conversation, whatever comes out of this. And hopefully you'll also have the capacity information at hopefully sometime soon to be able to inform that number and what you get as your allocation as well. Since you are going to talk about this, I'm gonna just skip to our next steps and what to expect. So March, I am still working on summarizing all the development data. I will say the plan developments are making it a little harder to organize and compile the summaries, but we'll get through it. And then we'll also provide the assumptions that we're using for the inventory and capacity analysis to be able to make any adjustments as necessary and help inform us of any changes again in your zoning and what to look out for. In April, we're hoping to have the inventory available. And again, that'll be in the form of like an online GIS map where you can click on the parcels and see what they're categorized as and what their assumptions were. And then with that, you'll get the capacity calculation tables that have all those deductions. So you can track how that capacity was calculated. Once we have those materials, I've already got the report kind of set up to plug them in to, and you'll be able to look at your report sections hopefully in May, and we'll have some sort of preliminary consistency analysis related to the development trends, the assumptions, and what is allowed in your zones. So that first part of the 3 that I was talking about on that previous slide. And like I said before, the consistency analysis really won't be done for another year after the report is due in June.
Okay. So I assume that there will be at each one of these checkpoints or milestones, this information will be shared with Carl and Katrina and staff, and we'll have a chance to see what's going on.
Yes, absolutely. And it'll all be available online as well.
Okay, great. Any other questions on this one? My initial reaction is we probably ought to make that an ongoing part of the Planning and Building Committee agenda for the next 4 months. I think is what I'm quoting called. There's going to be intense interest, I'm sure, as we go through each one of these stages as to what the assumptions are and what it looks like. Any other questions on that slide?
I
Okay.
think that's the end for me. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jessica. Thank you very much. Very informative.
Yes, thank you so much.
Any other overall questions, comments? Okay, thank you, Jessica.
Yeah, thank you so much. Bye. Thank you for having me. Have a good one.
Thanks so much, Jessica. Really appreciate it. Great.
Okay. By my watch on the wall, we're about to the somewhere between 10 and 4:15. And I think we were planning on breaking it up at 4:30 or 5. Correct me if I'm wrong. 4:30 was the magic. Okay. And I think, Carl, you were going to take up where we left off last time and or go through the material, any questions in the material that you sent out right after the last meeting on the 1st of February. You sent out a letter on the 2nd that had all kinds of good data in it. Mm-hmm. The charts and that.
Yeah.
In the remaining time, I think we should entertain some questions based on the review of that. That was like drinking from a fire hose in the first part of that with all those spreadsheets. So
Councilmember Hines, would Carl be able to provide you with a brief update of where we are with the persons per household prior to fielding questions?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so that was, as you'll recall, the last time we met, that was kind of the big focus point. What we focused the discussion around was the persons per household number. And that was really what Katrina and I had been focusing on too when we first started kind of digging into these spreadsheets and all this information, drinking from the fire hose, Councilmember Hines says. And so if you'll remember, there was going to be another meeting coming up after our planning and building committee meeting with the cities and towns regional geography kind of hash through those numbers and ask questions. And believe it or not, the main topic at that meeting was also the persons per household number. Everybody really focused in on that. There was a lot of questions about it, a lot of consternation, and ultimately we didn't get to a real final answer at that meeting. Where we ended up was we need more information. All the jurisdictions were kind of felt like we just needed to understand that persons per household number better, and we asked the consultant to kind of go back and play around with the data a little bit and come back to us. And so that's how the meeting ended. Subsequent to that meeting, Katrina and I actually met one-on-one with the consultant to ask about our persons per household numbers specifically, and it was a real good discussion. We left the meeting with her in a really good place. She had some takeaways that she was going back to. This is a consultant from AHBO, and so she left the meeting to go back and do some more digging for us. We really wanted to find out what our persons per household numbers were previously in the last go around on the growth allocation, so we could kind of get an understanding of how it played into those numbers previously. And we also wanted to, let's see, what was the other question that we left her with? Katrina, can you remind me what the other question was? Sorry, just completely.
Our assumed persons per household was the 2.16 number.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it was one of the numbers that jumped out to us as potentially being inaccurate. And so I don't want to steal your thunder, Carl, but essentially when we met with the consultant, we asked the question, why are we at 2.16 for Gig Harbor when all of the other cities that are with us are 2.5 persons per household or above? And the consultant essentially spent a lot of time looking through the reason to that. And what we found out is that they utilized the OFM small geography exercise that was conducted in 2019 for leading into 2020. And essentially what that did and why our number is the way it is Harbor Hill was generally under construction at that time. And our vacancy rate or unoccupied structure rate at that time is so high that it is dragging down our persons per household essentially. So what Carl and I asked the consultant to do is, instead of relying on that low number, which we know is not accurate because now those dwelling units in Harbor Hill are 95% occupied, we don't believe the 2.16 number is accurate. I think that's what Carl was leading to. So I will let you finish.
It was the Harbor Hill that I was trying to remember that we had asked her to look into and take into account for. So all that said, I just heard back from her, and she's still looking into it. She hasn't had time to dig as deep as she would like to. She has an email into the county to ask some of those questions directly. And so we're still kind of waiting for her to get back to us with more answers. And unfortunately, because she's a consultant working for Pierce County, we only have so much control over the process on that side. So effectively, we don't have all the answers that we wanted. And so we don't have all the answers that we'd like to share as far as persons per household go at this point. But I expect to very soon based on the email that I just received from her. So I think Councilmember Branich, you had a question?
Yes. So Katrina, what did you mention that the OFM small city, what was that report?
Yeah, it's the Office of Financial Management. They do a small area estimate each year. And that is in lieu of every 10-year census when we know we get the most accurate data. so essentially it's a mini census, if you will, and they make some generalizations. And what we know about gig harbors for 2019 is, again, in the north area of our city, we had a lot of units that were unoccupied at that time, but in some stage of construction. And therefore our vacancy rate was much higher.
So where is that report at? That small area estimate?
I believe you can locate it on the OFM website.
Okay. Because this persons per household is really important, because that math intertwines with the number of units that we need to plan for.
Exactly. And, you know, that's what, you know, why Carl and I are looking so intently into this topic, because we do know that it will directly go to the sizing of our city and how many units we will need to accommodate. The more folks living in a house, the less, you know, homes. I mean, that's an overgeneralization, but generally that's how it works.
Well, absolutely. Hey, Carl, do you have the ability to pull up that horizontal chart?
The spreadsheet we were looking at last time?
Yeah. And since then, about 2/3 of the way to the right on that spreadsheet, there was a red box where some jurisdictions already put in some of their requested numbers. Has there been any updates on that?
There we go.
I believe that there was.
That's it right there.
Yeah, were these the numbers that you had seen previously? They're the same?
No, I don't know if Bob, we were looking at that earlier today. I don't think there was that many numbers in there, was there?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I think some of these were added in that, so some of the jurisdictions came forward at that meeting that we had subsequent to the last planning and building committee meeting. And so this probably would reflect some new numbers.
Well, boy, just looking at that looks like it adds up to 16,000 without us.
It adds up to 18,356 right here. And we're looking at
that's the target number that we need to get to at the end, isn't it?
18,535.
Yeah, for all the small cities.
Yeah. And so there was a lot
if you had 7.3, that's 10 on the first two. And then Edgewood's another 5, that's 15 right there.
So again, it's important to remember when we're looking at these staff level working worksheets that these are just preliminary numbers similar to our discussions here today. They don't represent any formal decision making and are not necessarily representative of what will be approved.
No, I understand that completely, but I mean, this is encouraging to see, at least from my perspective, I'm always about local control, and if we want to grow faster, if our residents come to the council, we want to grow faster, we want more density, we always have the ability to do that. I hate it when we get the top down, where they're ramming numbers down our throat that we've got to meet. So the lower number that we can come in with, and we can always go up, but you can never go back down. So
we just have to, we have to keep in mind that number, whatever that number is that we choose, that it is something, realistic, because it's something that we can attain, I suppose, right? Because we need to meet that target. Otherwise, that's where you kind of get upside down in this process. And, Katrina and I have talked a lot about what this number is. And, we've talked a lot about growth rates and percentages. And that's what a lot of the jurisdictions are kind of hanging their hats on, or looking at, okay, what was our growth rate previously? Where did we start out? Where did we end up? And then sort of massaging these numbers a little bit to fall within those, maybe a range of growth rates for us. And so there's been a lot of discussion that way. There's been a lot of discussion about the persons per household and, how the persons per household number affects the outcome of this data. But we can't artificially choose persons per household numbers either. I mean, those have to be steeped in some, there has to be some basis for them, some justification for why we're choosing, a given number. And, I think there is some latitude within this process to be able to sort of massage these numbers a little bit. But like I said, we've got to have some justification for why we're massaging it a certain way.
Well, yeah, I understand that completely. Could you scroll that to the left, please? Right about there. So we had a 2030 total population allocation of 10,500, right?
Yes.
Okay, and our base year, which is 2020, I'm assuming our population is 11,240.
Right.
Okay, so how is it that we have a under the 2030 housing capacity? It's not in parentheses. It says 1781.
Mm-hmm.
So
those are housing units. Those are not people. So that's where our persons per household comes in. A housing unit is a multiplier of, or a division rather, of our total population divided by the persons per household, and you'll get units.
Right, but that's the 2030, and I know we're kind of on to the 2044 now, but that 2030, we've already met the 2030 because our initial allocation was 10,500. We're already at 11,240.
Yeah, we exceeded.
So essentially, we've exceeded what was planned for in the previous update. As we've talked about at previous meetings, we don't get to bank the extra population or what was above what our previous target was. So essentially, this process is a starting over point. It is something that we could utilize again if that reasonable measures that Jessica was talking about before, we grew at a significantly higher rate than what was planned for. And so if we were going to grow at a lower rate this time, that could be justification for that. But again, we don't get to bank that population that we outgrew.
Well, that's why the next one over, that unabsorbed 2030 population growth, that 740 in parentheses, I'm assuming that's what we were over in housing units. If you multiply that times the PPHH.
Yeah, so what that's saying is that we were 740 people over. So whatever our persons per household was assumed at that time, yes.
Okay, does that answer your questions, Councilmember French?
Yeah.
Okay. I guess I had a question on the residents per household, the 2.11 or whatever the number was.
2.16.
Yeah. What is our plan to come up with a substantive, an answer that we think is more accurate and that is defendable?
Well, twofold. One, like we said, we're asking the consultant to go and look at what we utilized previously, so we have a good idea of how those growth projections and what those growth projections were based on previously. And secondarily, we're asking them to look at that 2019 or 2020 data and look at the Harbor Hill vacancies and make sure that was accounted for in the data to make sure that assumption or understanding is calculated for. And we're also looking at talking with the Peninsula School District to find out what sort of demographic data that they have for the area, which we know that they do have a lot. Obviously, that's why they're building more schools. And finding out if there's anything in there that we could use as part of our justification to say, look, our number is definitely higher. Maybe it was this previously, but things have changed a lot in Gig Harbor now, and we think that should be reflected. And if we can come up with those, that's the supporting substance, to be able to raise that number, they will support us in it. But again, it's like I was saying before, we can't just come up with a number and throw it out there, which is what I feel like maybe a couple of the other jurisdictions are doing. So there's going to be a lot more discussion around this. I think they really wanted to kind of hit this hard and fast and just kind of spit a number out here and be done with this process, but it is not going that way at all. And for our geography, it's definitely not going that way. And I'll say for the core cities geography, they're really struggling because none of the core cities want to take any growth. They're all fighting over who's taking what, and nobody wants to take anything. We're kind of in the opposite camp a little bit in that some of these smaller jurisdictions do want to take growth this time around. So it's interesting to listen in on these conversations. But that's kind of, I hope that answers your question, Councilman Rhines. Maybe Katrina I don't know if you wanted to say more about that or not.
Okay.
Yeah, just to summarize, so we've asked the consultant to look at what our persons per household was during the last effort. So that's number one. Number two, we are again looking at that 2019 small area estimate with a magnifying glass. And Carl has already reached out to the Peninsula School District to talk about student generation rate within the Harbor Hill area. And from that, we can determine the amount of households that are up there for the amount of dwelling units. And if we then can calculate some number of households within those plats that have kids of school age that are going to school, we can then determine pretty accurately what a person per household is for that area. And then we'll be able to look at that 2019 number. What Carl just mentioned about the core cities geography is really important, and Councilmember Himes, perhaps you'll get to watch this at a PCRC level. But as Carl mentioned, the core cities are not wanting to take their share, at least yet, of the larger amount of population that they were given. And so that is also something that Carl's going to be watching from a staff level to see how that's going to play out regionally. If they're not able to take that or won't, how is that going to impact the other geographies? And so that'll be something that we'll be watching, and Councilmember Himes will likely want to watch for that as well.
Okay, that sounds good. I think that the message here is staying close to the process, anticipating where we're going to have issues, just like this one, okay, just like the persons per household. And basically working on factual ways to basically challenge some assumptions and get some revised numbers in here that are defendable. I'm not talking about a pencil job here. I'm talking about defendable numbers, and I think that's one of them. Okay, that's key. So I think you're on the right track here. The other one is this that is concerning to me is this based on permits making projections as opposed to where we are today in terms of actual zoning requirements. And that one is a little bit scary, called I'm not sure exactly what the methodology should be, but I'm convinced that the bulk of what we're looking at in terms of permitted properties they were probably cast prior to 2018, 2019, when we made significant revisions to the zoning requirements, particularly on overlays like PRDs and stuff like that.
Councilmember Himes, with regard to that, please keep in mind that Carl has sent to Pierce County our changes in our zoning code. So they do know our new densities and they know the other changes that have been made. So although Jessica is talking about looking at previous trends and how that factors into capacity, those are the numbers that are utilized for that trend data will not necessarily be fully utilized when we're looking at a capacity number. So they have our current zoning and our current assumptions, and they'll utilize those in looking at the zone by zone capacity factors.
Okay, as a cross check versus the building permit numbers?
Yeah, they're two separate data points used for two
Okay.
separate things. Yeah.
Okay, as long as that's going on and we're aware of it, I think that's good. That's good. Councilmember French.
Yeah, so when is the date of the red column those numbers gonna get, when are you guys all sitting down around the table and gonna figure that out?
They have not rescheduled another meeting as of yet. They've just been, like I said, Brittany, the woman from AHPL who's been working on this and heading up the project from the consultant side, just sent that email off to us acknowledging our questions and acknowledging that she's looking further into them. And I know that she's working with other jurisdictions on the same. And so, they're working in the background, and I would expect that once they feel like they're at a good place with all the jurisdictions, that will come back together and look at these, look at the numbers that everybody has kind of come to, and then figure out where we're at and what to do about the fact that we're likely going to be over this regional share.
Well, have they been asking you, where do you guys think the city of Gig Harbor is at?
Well, that's what they're wanting from us. Yes, that's correct. They would love it if we just gave them a number today. But what we've been telling them is we need more understanding, and we want more background information on some of these numbers, and we really want to get to a realistic PPH that then we can use to come up with a number that we feel comfortable with. And that's been our message to them all along, and that we're working with our planning and building committee and keeping them apprised of everything that's going on. And we obviously need their concurrence when we get to that point. So. Will you guys be coming up to a number on your own, or will that be coming through this committee or the council on, getting back to that red column? That's a good question. As far as the full council, we would like to come up with that number, I think, in this forum here with the planning and building committee. And then I don't know if it needs to go back to the full council from here. I mean, I guess that's a question for you all. Katrina's shaking her head, so I'm assuming maybe not.
Well, I would just, like I said at the last meeting, I really appreciate staff bringing this committee into this process, because this is so critical from my perspective on, and I think things would have worked out a lot better for our city in the long run if this had been more of a collaborative, the way it's going right now versus in the past when, at least, and maybe I was just a stupid councilman that wasn't paying any attention, but I never had been apprised of this whole process. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I would concur with that. And I would assume that before any number is given out, we've got I want to call it at least a city-based version of the Buildable Lands report called We Think We Know Where the Real Number Is. And I can't imagine anybody asking for a number prior to the Buildable Lands report called, well, how do you know you can do it? Okay, one way or the other.
I think that's a really good point, Councilmember Himes, and that's definitely something that Katrina voiced when we first started talking about this. It seems like we're putting the cart before the horse here, and so that's some of the message that's been brought back to Pierce County and the consultant as well. That there's more information that we really should be getting first put into this process. And and we're going to have census data coming out this year, and that's very important data. And so unfortunately, it looks like it's going to be delayed. It was supposed to be coming out soon, but I think it's been delayed until maybe in September, I believe. So unfortunately, it's kind of a ways off. So it's not, the stars aren't aligning necessarily for us as far as all this goes. But I think that's a really good point.
I agree. I think we're doing really well. I don't think before Katrina came on that we did this with Pierce County. Carl might know, but I think so I think we're really trying to, we wish we even had more control on our UGA, but we're getting better and better, and we're communicating back and forth. So Michelle, Carl, Katrina, Paul, all of you, thank you very much for your hard work.
Yes, thank you. This is, as Councilmember Franz was saying, this is great. I was not aware of this taking place in prior cycles. Let me put it that way. That this level of understanding and analysis and understanding was going on. Maybe it was, and I just wasn't aware of it. But I'm aware of it now, and I appreciate it. So thank you, Councilmember Franz.
Yeah. So how? We're going to be coming up with these numbers here now, and say, we're figuring. I'm assuming that we're going to be figuring the buildable lands is going to take into consideration our UGA. So say we get through this UGA study and portions north of the city or west of the city get taken out of the UGA. How will that affect densities in the city itself?
So the UGA, the development that's going on in the UGA, as Jessica explained, there'll be actual development data that's put out in the Buildable Lands report for that. There'll also be capacity data with the assumptions. And as she mentioned, those will be based on assumptions of growth within that UGA Pierce County. So for us, those numbers, the UGA numbers, are not associated with our numbers. Our spreadsheet will be completely separate from that. Now, if we annex that UGA area, part of that annexation will be an assumption of the dwelling units that are within that UGA area, as well as the capacity. So we don't just bring the existing units, we also bring the future growth associated with that into the city. And that won't meld until that occurs.
Perfect. So the city limits is isolated from the UGA. They're two separate data points.
Correct.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Councilmember Markley, you care to weigh in on this?
Hi, yes, I'm so sorry. I haven't been able to have my camera on. Every time I turn it on, my phone it starts to disconnect the meeting. So I'm in a weird spotty internet area at the moment, but no, I wanted to echo what Councilmember Himes and Councilmember Franich said, and the mayor too, as far as just being very thankful to staff for all of your hard work and all of the information that you've been able to provide to us. I have to admit, it is a lot to take in. It's a lot to try to absorb and keep track of. But you guys really lay it out in a way that's easy to understand. So thank you for that. And I'm just looking forward to kind of seeing how all these numbers end up playing out as we all are. But glad to know that the city limits numbers are separate from UGA numbers, and it'll just be interesting to see how this all works out. So thank you very, very much for your all your hard work on this and all the information that you've been providing to us. Really very, very appreciative of that.
All right, Councilmember Franny.
Well, my hand's still up. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, these numbers, all these calculations were going on under the last administration. So the staff was still doing it. I just appreciate the staff's willingness and the administration's willingness to bring the council into these discussions rather than just getting them dropped on us as it was getting done under the last regime. So, yeah.
Right. And I may be coming forward to you to make sure I don't get caught in what I would term a blitz in the PCRC. You never know what they can come up with in terms of devious approaches to difficult problems. So yeah, I may be looking for your counsel. In fact, I'm sure I will be. Okay. Anything else? If not, I guess going forward, I would just assume from an agenda planning standpoint that this is going to be a key item basically for the next 3 to 4 months. Okay. I can see updates, developments, et cetera, happening. So I would just plan on this being almost like a standing item for probably the next 4 months. I think that's going to happen. Any other items that we should cover before we adjourn? Great, thank you. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Unanimous. Thank you and good evening.
Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Great week.